Hello and welcome to Into the Multiverse. I am your host, Josh Peck. It turns out geoengineering might not be a conspiracy theory anymore. We're going to talk about that and a lot more. Now, I know we have a different setup. It's only for today. Don't worry, we will be back in the studio in no time. I have recently been stricken ill. I got a cold or something, and then it turned into this stomach flu thing for a couple of days. And basically, short story, I might still be contagious. I don't want to go into the office and get everybody else sick, so I have opted to record Into the Multiverse from home today. This is my at-home studio. For those of you who follow me on dailyrenegade.com or my other YouTube channel and various places, then you're probably already familiar with this studio. For those of you who are not, kind of looks like that. But yeah, so it's just for today, and then we'll be back in the glorious Skywatch TV studio. So yeah, that's the story behind that. Okay. A recent story came out on Wired.com talking about geoengineering. Now, this used to be regarded as a pretty kind of laughable conspiracy theory. Not saying I ever laughed at it, but just by and large, generally in the culture, it was seen that way. But not so much anymore. And now there are even scientists, a lot of them, advocating for it because of the myth of climate change, of global warming, I should say. And by the way, if you want to know why I call it a myth, I believe it was episode 102 or 104 or something like that of Into the Multiverse. We went through all of the major claims of climate change advocates and debunked all of them and showed how they're all faulty. So that's why I say that. But so this article on Wired says, once seen as spooky sci-fi, geoengineering to halt runaway climate change is now being looked at with growing urgency. You see what the enemy does with these lies? That's why things like climate change and anti-scientific things like that is so dangerous, because it creates new public policy that can be really detrimental. So it says the spate of dire scientific warnings that the world community can no longer delay major cuts in carbon emissions, coupled with a recent surge in atmospheric concentrations of CO2, has left a growing number of scientists saying that it's time to give the controversial technologies a serious look. And this is one of those technologies, too. Once it's out there, it is very difficult to take back. You pretty much can't. I mean, it depends on the type of technology, but let's say what one of them on the table that's being considered right now is literally like chemtrails, the chemtrail conspiracy is turning out to be true as well. But they want to take like reflective pieces of metal and shoot them out of the back of planes to reflect the sunlight. I mean, it's absolutely insane. Once that's done, that's it. How do you can't go back and collect all those little nanoparticles and things. But One geoengineering advocate, former British Governor Chief Scientist David King, told a conference last fall, quote, "Time is no longer on our side. What we do over the next 10 years will determine the future of humanity for the next 10,000 years," end quote. And, of course, he doesn't offer any real reason to believe that. He doesn't cite any scientific studies saying that exact thing. When you look into a lot of those scientific studies, they're based on already debunked studies from years ago that were totally fraudulent. So King helped secure the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, but he no longer believes cutting planet warming emissions is enough to stave off disaster. He is in the process of establishing a Center for Climate Repair at Cambridge University. It would be the world's first major research center dedicated to a task that he says is going to be necessary. Technologies earmarked for the Cambridge Center's attention include a range of efforts to restrict solar radiation from reaching the lower atmosphere, including spraying aerosols of sulfate particles, this is what I was talking about, into the stratosphere and freezing rapidly warming parts of the polar regions by deploying tall ships to pump salt particles from the ocean into polar clouds, making them brighter. I mean, this is absolutely insane. There's no way to know what devastating effects that actually could have on our planet. global warming, climate change, whatever they're calling it this year, that's one thing, because we can actually track the progress. There have been a lot of doomsday prophecies from climate change advocates that haven't come true. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that these things are always predicted like 30 or 50 years into the future, because by the time that time comes, people already forgot. So a lot, we have already forgotten, by and large, all the claims that were made in the 70s and 80s that global warming would cause. None of that stuff ended up coming true, but it was long. It was short enough of a time where it was alarming to people who heard it, but it's a long enough time where by the time we get there, we've already forgotten, and we already have a new set of crazy theories to debunk. So I don't think that it's a coincidence that it's that specific amount of time. Usually they go like 30 to 50 years in the future. But there's no telling what actual consequences this would have on the planet. And once it's done, there's no undoing it. So it says United States scientists are on the case. The National Academies last October launched a study into sunlight reflection technologies, including their feasibility, impacts, and risk, and governance requirements. That's the other thing too. There's a reason that certain political parties are so big into this stuff. It's because it allows the government to grow even larger than it already is. It gives the government more control. Marcia McNutt, president of the National Academy of Sciences, said, quote, "We are running out of time to mitigate catastrophic climate change. Some of these inventions may need to be considered in the future," end quote. The study's prospective authors held their first meeting in Washington, D.C. at the end of April. Speakers included David Keith, a Harvard University physicist who has developed his own patented technology for using chemistry to remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere. By the way, what is that going to do to plant life? That's plant food. CO2 is basically plant food. Isn't that going to kill off more trees and things? Kelly Wanser of the Marine Cloud Brightening Project, which is studying the efficacy of seeding clouds with sea salt and other materials to reflect more sunlight back into space. The project is preparing for future field trials. China, too, has an active government-funded research program. It insists it has no current plans for deployment, but is looking, among other things, at how solar shading might slow the rapid melting of Himalayan glaciers. In the book of Revelation, we read a lot about different prophecies and things that are, we might say are natural, but maybe they're not as natural as they sound. All these earthquakes and the sun getting either darker or hotter, depending on which prophecy you're looking at the time, all these problems with like blood moons and all this stuff. What if some of this stuff has to do with that? What if it's us actually doing it to ourselves? What if all of these natural disasters are caused because of this stuff and it's not so natural? It goes on. Geoengineering the climate to halt global warming has been discussed as almost as long as the threat of warming itself. American researchers back in the 1960s suggested floating billions of white objects such as golf balls on the oceans to reflect sunlight. In 1977, Cesar Merchetti of the Austria-based International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis discussed ways of catching all of Europe's CO2 emissions and injecting them into sinking Atlantic Ocean currents. And again, who knows what that would do to the oceans. In 1982, Soviet scientist Mikhail Bodiko proposed filling the stratosphere with sulfate particles to reflect sunlight back into space. The first experiments to test the idea of fertilizing the oceans with iron to stimulate the growth of CO2-absorbing algae were carried out by British researchers in 1995. 2 years later, Edward Teller, inventor of the hydrogen bomb, proposed putting giant mirrors into space. Still, many climate scientists until recently regarded such proposals as fringe, if not heretical, arguing that they undermine the case for urgent reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And that's another thing that they'll use these extreme things to do too. They'll use it to try to force policy. So they'll say, well, if you're not going to reduce your emissions, then we have no choice. We're going to have to send chemtrails into the stratosphere and poison everybody with that. Imagine what that would do. Those particles, who's to say that they're actually going to stay up there forever? Isn't there a saying, something about what goes up must do something come down, I think? When all that stuff comes down and we're breathing it in, what do you think that's going to do? It's just absolute insanity. These people are essentially threatening the lives of policymakers. If you don't put this into policy that we need to reduce our greenhouse gases, expand the government, and go through all these crazy programs that, by the way, don't work. Remember Solyndra? If you don't do that, then we're going to risk your lives by pumping all this stuff into the atmosphere, or filling the oceans with this gas, or killing off the trees by reducing all of this stuff, or putting mirrors into space. It's ridiculous, but that's the world that we live in, and you can see what they're doing. These are essentially bully tactics. With no real science backing it up. They say they're looking at the efficacy of these things, but the only real way to test something like that is to do it. How else do you really test it? But again, they're not taking into effect what happens when this stuff inevitably is rained down upon us. And again, that very well might have a lot to do with some of the Bible prophecy we read about in the book of Revelation. Some of the seemingly natural disasters that occur might not be so natural. A group of scientists writing in Nature as recently as April last year called solar engineering outlandish and unsettling, redolent of science fiction. But the mood is shifting, and it's shifting fast. That was only a year ago, and look how fast this is shifting now. There is broad international scientific agreement that the window of opportunity to avoid breaching the Paris climate target of staying well below 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit is narrowing sharply. A pause in the rise of CO2 emissions that brought hope in 2015 and 2016 has ended. The increase has resumed at a time when we should be making progress toward the goal of having, meaning making in half, not having as in possessing, but having, HALVING, emissions by 2030, says Johan Rockström, science director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research. CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, the planetary thermostat, are now at 415 parts per million and rising by almost 3 parts per million each year, reaching levels that have not been seen in 3 million years. Quote, we have 2 years left to bend the curve, end quote, downward, says Rockström. That's another thing, too. We get... Those of us who pay attention to this stuff get so desensitized by the doomsday prophecies of this climate change stuff because they've been saying it for so long. And sometimes we as Christians make the mistake of just being desensitized to all doomsday prophecy all over the place, because you have climate change stuff that's been wrong over and over again, and then you have, prophecy, like Christian prophets, so-called Christian prophecies, that say, the rapture is going to happen in 1980, whatever, and then it doesn't happen, and that happens over and over again. And we become desensitized to the idea that Jesus is returning. There is an end of the world coming. Not in the way that we might think. It's the end of the world as we know it. We could say it that way. The world will be renewed and continue. But we know that the elements will melt with fervent heat. There's a lot of bad stuff that's going to happen. But we become desensitized to it because we hear it so much and then it doesn't happen. I believe that this whole thing is a plan of the enemy to desensitize us to the idea of the return of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And maybe that's because the time is short. Maybe that's because Jesus is returning soon. Maybe the enemy knows that too and knows their destruction is nigh. So they're going to try to desensitize us as much as possible so we're not paying attention. So maybe the coming of the Lord, whether by rapture or second coming, or or even our own just mortal physical deaths, we're not guaranteed another day on this earth. But however that comes, we'll be taken off guard because we're desensitized to it. Maybe that's why. I also believe that might contribute to the enemy's obsession with death. It says, and this is another Peck paraphrase because I don't have it memorized, but in Scripture it talks about how those who are perishing, they love death. It's because it desensitizes us to that idea, so that when it does happen, we have a greater chance of being caught off guard. You know, we're here one moment, then we're in eternity the next moment, face to face with Jesus, and now we're going to be judged. So all of this stuff, I believe, is a big desensitization campaign of the enemy. So don't let the enemy do that to you. Don't let that work. Don't become desensitized. Don't be the frog in the pot. Stay vigilant and stay pure. You know, don't fall for everything that you read or everything that you hear. Be a good researcher. Be a good Berean. Stay in the Word, and ultimately just rest in the hope of Jesus Christ, that He is coming back soon. And again, we're not guaranteed another day on this earth, whether by death or rapture. We don't know. So live every single day as if, I know it's a cliche to say this, but as if it could be your last, because one day you're going to be right. Again, I know that's a big cliche, but it is absolutely true. We have to stay vigilant. We cannot become desensitized to this. If we do, think about it this way. Why is there no loud opposition to this? Because so many people are desensitized. They don't have the passion or motivation to speak out against this stuff anymore. So they're desensitized to it, allowing these people to do whatever they want to the planet that we all have to live on. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's helpful. Next week, we should be back in the Skywatch studio. But yeah, so again, thank you so much. And listen, if you haven't had a chance, make sure you subscribe to this channel and click on the bell for notifications. Very important that you do so. YouTube likely won't tell you that a new Into the Multiverse is coming up anyway. We figure it's about 1 in 10, sometimes 1 in 100 actually get notified. So if you did get notified, you won the lottery. Most subscribers don't. Just know that every Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Central, you will get a new episode of Into the Multiverse. All right, everybody, it has been a blast. I hope this has been helpful. I'd love to know what you think. Leave me a comment in the comment section below. And until next time, love you all. Take care. God bless.